Jakob is a 7th-year PhD candidate in the history department at Georgetown University, a historian of early modern Europe and the world. His dissertation explores the socio-urban history of France's colonization efforts in the Indian Ocean, specifically in Pondicherry, during the late 17th and 18th centuries. His research has been funded by the U.S. Fulbright Commission, the Department of Education, the Mellon Foundation, and the Society for French Historical Studies.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this daunting but exciting panel. So today my paper is called Coloring Bodies and Casting Identities, Situating the French Indian Ocean World in the Enlightenment and 18th Century. It's very much a kind of offshoot of my dissertation research and more of a very much work in progress kind of thinking piece. In the light of a setting December sun, the body of a young boy lay sprawled on Pondicherry's seashore. Upon an initial examination, the Surgeon Major of Pondicherry, Germain Filios de Monnier, noted nothing more than the boy's physical features. He had been roughly 16 years old, 4.5 feet tall, beardless, with black eyes, and black, noir. After the surgeon declared the boy dead, the Frenchmen and other city's officials who had accompanied him to survey the body set out investigating who the boy had been and what had happened to him. Interpreters Rama and Laszlo from the Chaudhry Court, a judicial body which adjudicated disputes based on local custom in the city, were summoned, and they questioned a single witness, Pichon, a local tailor and a member of the Poulai caste. When neither Pichon, Rama, nor Lazarou could identify the body or identify the boy, his cadaver was sent to the Chaudhry Court to be displayed and guarded while further investigation continued. Unclaimed bodies were not uncommon in early 18th century Pondicherry, France's principal colony on the Indian subcontinent, nor likely in any other colony or in France itself. Whether they were French soldiers who died in training accidents, local workers and residents who drowned in the river while washing clothes, or fetal remains abandoned by mothers. French officials were greatly interested in documenting their investigations of these found bodies. Surgeons, counselors, merchants, midwives, and other witnesses came together in these documents to define not only death, but also the identities for the oft unknown faces. A major part of that identity, especially over the burgeoning decades of the 18th century and rise in enlightenment thinking, was that of color and race. Yet, unlike many other archival records scholars have previously used, in which we might hear, so-called, color as voiced, albeit often filtered through other voices by subjects, the reports of cadavers and the investigations surrounding them in Pondicherry offer an interesting entree into how color and race were ascribed to unknown others, as well as a window into the intellectual lineages and the narratives of race in the long 18th century Indian Ocean world. So then, how does one read the unnamed boy's so-called black body among the Indian Ocean's own racializing somatic landscape, which developed in tandem with that of the Atlantic Ocean? Though most subjects of French India were not of African descent, a major difference between the two thoracic spaces, noir remained an exceedingly common descriptive term Europeans attributed to local populations in the records of their daily lives. Pondicherry itself developed around a distinct urban segregation, la vie blanche et la vie noire, and when debating the appointment of commercial intermediaries, members of Pondicherry's own Superior Council often questioned which local media intermediaries were most beloved among les Noirs, and thus might have best access to the networks of production and trade which the French East India Company desired. At its most simple then, noir remained in French India a designation of others in the unenunciated blanc of French or other South Asian, Indo-European mixed races. Yet, as it was a blackness of a different shade which permeated then in the Atlantic, yet it was a blackness of a different shade than one that permeated in the Atlantic, and one that local specificities and context helped to extract. Being noir in Pondicherry meant any number of things, each with its own complicated meanings that French officials often sought witnesses in the community to help them identify. We know that this young boy was not of African descent, as more specific designations of such origins were regularly given. Kafra, which was used to identify those of East African origins, or Malagasy, for its own complex cultural construction from the southwestern African islands, as well as Indian Ocean islands off the coast of Africa, as well as the rare Senegalese or Angolese, which were employed by French officials when certain black bodies do appear in the records, often as slaves. But for the vast majority, noir and other signifiers wouldn't have been appropriate, and instead, their blackness originated elsewhere. When Robert Shaw arrived in Pondicherry in 1690, he commented on the blackness, the noirceur, of the local populations. While Brahmins were swarthy like the Portuguese and Iberians, the esclaves and les esclaves, and their socially lower populations of the city were black like the blackness spoke. He goes a little further into explicating the reasons for such divisions, but Shaw's claim reveals a bedrock upon which the coloring of bodies and forging identities could be laid: caste. Caste, despite some modern claims that its invention by the British in the 19th century, was a socially real fact and experience-defining practice in the pre-colonial period and much longer through India. Though the French didn't necessarily understand all of the nuances, changes, and complications of this endogenous construction, their access to goods was dictated by intercaste realities around the city. Competition between left and right-hand castes in Pondicherry were often central parts of the negotiation process for cloth and goods. Further, though less common than the plantation colonies, when the French created census records of their cities in India, they were careful to list and explicate what families belonged to which castes and where they lived in the city, populating both. Caste permeated life and knowledge, especially race-making, throughout the emerging colonial space of French India. Here, then, is where the Europeans had to turn their investigations to non-Europeans for help. When French officials sought out families, local experts, and other relations who might know the identity of the bodies, they did so in terms of seeking out the caste of these black bodies. They relied on community members to help situate them in the cadavers in the social landscape of the city. Often, the first calls were to the interpreter of the chaudhry, knowledgeable men who had linguistic and community ties that helped the French to discern unknown information. When, if anything, could be gleaned from the body, others were called, witnesses, or perhaps medical experts. When the fetal remains of a baby were found on the street of Blacktown in the 1720s, not the 1920s, investigators called upon a midwife, not only to ascertain the potential cause of death or stillborn nature of the baby, whether it be infanticide or not. Many of the discerning information they asked the midwife was about the caste and the potential identity of the mother. Spouses, families, neighbors all came to home desks that the French were called upon to help identify any information who might be found with the bodies there. If all else failed, like the boy found on Pondicherry shore, the bodies might be transported to the chaudhry court, where they were guarded and displayed, where community members might come and identify missing relatives, hoping to give further designations. So then what does all of this, really no claim, what does all of this tell us about diversifying directions in the 18th century scholarship? Certainly, recent scholarship has started to combine Atlantic understandings and the Indian Ocean in terms of both law and slavery. But honestly, there's not much that we can glean yet from these records. There's certainly more work to be done. But it does offer insights into the complicated constructions of race in the Indian Ocean. Swarthy, like the Brahmins, who were swarthy like the Iberians and the Portuguese, show us these connections to European understandings well before colonization and the expansion of the African slave trade about conceptions of blackness within Europe. With its own economic, social, political, religious, and linguistic landscapes that predated Europeans' arrival into the Indian Ocean, racializing language and meaning had often divergent paths in that of the Atlantic. Yet, in instances like the Massillon plantation colonies, which brought labor from the Indian subcontinent, from Southeast Asia, and from the wider Indian Ocean world in France, these things often collided. Wider, more informed views on the Indian Ocean, bringing its rich histories not only of race but also of empire building to global France, can help us to better understand these kinds of complicated and nuanced studies.